Newsnight reveals England and Wales have seen 3,000 extra deaths a week for this time of year. What's silently killing so many people?
They're most commonly due to circulating influenza, and particularly in older people, sometimes outbreaks in care homes, for example.
And remember this Labour Party political broadcast?
An entrepreneurial Britain is my dream, and you know, it's working.
So what does Simon Woodruff of Yo Sushi think of Labour now?
What worries me is that Ed Miliband has gone out to the country and he's appealing to the masses by saying, look, all these big fat cats are making enormous profits. And what I want our leaders to say is we want enormous profits.
The Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls is here to clarify. Also tonight, a new level of horror as ISIS released the moments the Jordanian hostage was burned to death. Jordans say they'll now execute this suicide bomber in revenge. We'll ask the Jordanian general if it kicks their conflict with ISIS into a new phase. Hello, good evening. Every year a certain number of people die at this time of year. This winter the figures seem mysteriously much higher. Newsnight spotted that the number of deaths in England and Wales are 30% higher than in past years. What's going on? Chris Cook thinks he's understood why. And a big part of the answer is probably flu.
This midwinter is certainly bleak. It's not the coldest of years, but Newsnight has been following one very striking aspect of it: the death rate.
We monitor each week the number of deaths recorded, and since just before Christmas there's been a substantial increase in the numbers. So in the last week, for example, there have been over 13,000 deaths, which is almost a 30% increase. And we do this because it's an important way of monitoring the impact of things like infections, but also of extremes of weather, such as cold weather or hot weather, in fact.
The rise in death rates has been quite sudden. This line shows you the average number of deaths registered in each week for the autumn and winter over the past 5 years. That little trough, that's the Christmas period, when public offices are shut for the bank holidays. Registrations get delayed. Now, this is the figure for this year. It looks much the same all the way into January, when it diverges up to that 3,000 deaths a week difference.
Well, peaks in deaths during the winter are not uncommon. We haven't had a peak of this size for the last 3 years, but they certainly do occur. They're most commonly due to circulating influenza, and particularly in older people, sometimes outbreaks in care homes, for example, but in older people generally. But also cold weather. So a snap of cold weather, such as we had on the 28th of January, would certainly have an effect. And sometimes it can be gastrointestinal infections, so norovirus, or rotavirus are the other two causes.
This year, flu is certainly important. This is the rate at which patients were admitted to hospital with the flu last year, and this is the number for winter this year so far. The prevalent strain, AH3N2, takes a particular toll on older people, who, Public Health England estimate, have been dying at a higher than expected rate for 6 weeks.
Vaccination remains the single most important thing to do to prevent these sorts of increase in excess deaths due to influenza and control influenza in general. Vaccination is not infallible, and each year we try and anticipate the subtypes that will be circulating, but it's not always the right type. This year, in fact, it is the right type, but even if you get the right type, there can be antigenic drift, so that by the end of the flu season, the circulating flu might not be as well matched to the vaccine subtype as it was at the beginning, so the efficacy can be reduced.
Some of the issues driving the high death rates, like flu, will also have raised pressure on the accident and emergency departments in recent months. But experts don't think that the recent stress on A&Es or the social care sectors caused the rise in deaths.
Flu viruses can spread if you don't catch your cough.
Now, working out what exactly did cause that rise will take some time. But for now, stay warm and, as the recently revived ad campaign says,
catch it, bin it, kill it.
Well, Chris Cook is here now, and Chris, you've sort of uncovered these figures and seem to be heading towards an understanding of them. What's the most important thing to look out for now, though?
Well, the key thing to follow now is what Public Health England say. Public Health England is quite an odd, slightly obscure institution. It does things like monitor flu, monitor deaths. It issues advice on what happens in case an Ebola outbreak happens in a prison. They think these terrible things so that you don't have to. And what they'll be doing now is they're monitoring death rates. I'll be keeping an eye on it. One of the things that they'll be publishing relatively soon is a report on that drift that was mentioned. That's the way that the viruses mutate so that they may no longer match the vaccines that we're using. That's the kind of stuff we're going to need to understand exactly what's going on in the coming months and years. And in fact, it'll be quite a long time before we get a very full understanding of exactly what's driven all of the death in the last winter.
Chris, thanks very much. Now, one business leader rising up against Labour doesn't make a trend. 3 or 4 start to look a bit more tricky. The party that once wooed the city and the business community, the so-called prawn cocktail offence, now has to start deciding on its position. If they do want to get business on side, you have to admit it's not gone that well so far. But what if they've made a deliberate choice to scare off the fat cats? Perhaps many voters would welcome the reprioritising. We'll talk to Ed Balls in a second, Shadow Chancellor, and don't forget former City Minister. First, here's Allegra Stratton.
The second face on the right, Theodore Roosevelt, took on vested interests in early 20th century America. But he was no Red Ted, he was a Republican, and he's Ed Miliband's hero. When the boss of Boots said this weekend it could be a catastrophe if Labour got into power, yesterday Ed Miliband hit back.
Mr. Pacina, who's been trying to lecture us about what we should be doing in this country, frankly I think he should be paying his taxes.
This morning it was the turn of former M&S boss, new Tory peer Stuart Rose. Writing in the Daily Mail, he said Britain was seeing a 70s throwback in our politics, that there had been a turning of the tide, a steady drumbeat of anti-business policies from Labour. All of these figures have links to the Tory party. It would appear to be an orchestrated attack. The Tories make little secret of their wish for business to get out and back them. At Davos recently, the Chancellor is said to have told a private meeting of business leaders, if you agree with us, if you support lower taxes and deficit reduction, a Tory programme for government, then you have to get out there and say so. In the early 90s, Labour wooed business with the so-called prawn cocktail circuit. Now business is comforted that a Labour government wouldn't stage an in-out European referendum, but there are concerns.
From the Beatles to Mary Quant, to the present day, Britain holds that purse of innovation.
The boss of restaurants, Yo Sushi, was a Blair Brown supporter. Here he is fronting up the party political broadcast for Labour in 2004. In 2009, he gave money to Conservative Oliver Letwin.
An entrepreneurial Britain is my dream, and you know, it's working.
It scares me. I was a Labour Party supporter during the Blair Brown thing, and I was a supporter because I'm a believer that politics needs to make money. UK PLC needs to be a profitable business, and I thought they were a good management team. What worries me is that Ed Miliband has gone out to the country and he's appealing to the masses by saying, look, all these big fat cats are making enormous profits. And what I want our leaders to say is we want enormous profits. And yes, we're going to share them all out later, but first of all, we've got to make it.
Ed Miliband believes the centre ground has shifted. Yesterday, US President Barack Obama levied a one-off tax on the profits held by American companies abroad. The radical left-wing Syriza win in Greece also signals a shift. Insiders say that business can do business with the Shadow Chancellor, Ed Balls, and the Shadow Business Secretary, Chaka Umuna, that the pair have been assiduous in courting industry. While it may not quite be the prawn cocktail circuit of the early 90s, the shrimps aren't yet on the barbecue. Instead, one senior figure with links to the Labour Party says the problem is the leader. Ed Miliband, they say, hasn't held a single meeting with a senior businessman for a long time. Ed Miliband instead thinks he's taking on business and that's going to win him votes.
Ed Miliband's attacks on business certainly play to those people already on the left spectrum. So he's trying to stem the flow away from Labour, those people flirting perhaps with the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, even the SNP, and he's trying to bring them back on side from a fairly sort of weak position.
Is that for me? Thank you so much. It's yellow. Thank you so much. Yours is yellow too. I'm looking for some red.
The more pro-business of Labour's team have been trying to mould Ed Miliband, stop the direct attacks on business bosses for fear of antagonising others. Roosevelt may have had a bully pulpit. Some in Ed Miliband's team think he must use his sparingly.
That was Allegra Stratton, and Labour's Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls joins me now. Ed Balls, I know you want to kick off on infrastructure. That's what you've been talking about today. So in terms of this independent commission, it's meant to basically push through the schemes that have been ducked and delayed,
Sure.
like a third runway at Heathrow, for example. I mean, if the Davis report comes up and says that's the right way to go, would you say, yep, Labour's on board for that?
Well, airport capacity and the need for a new runway is exactly the kind of dither and delay and prevarication that the Armit Review and our independent commission is designed to stop. Because what we're saying is, let's have an independent commission which makes recommendations and then the politicians decide and hold us to account. Now, in the case of a Heathrow and a new runway, we've been debating this for 30 or 40 years. It's about time we decided. I think it's a pity Davis is coming after the election, but we are clear. Once Davis reports, taking into account the need for environmental safeguards to be met, we will build the new capacity we need. We'll move as fast as we can.
Would that mean saying, yeah, signing off Heathrow then, the third runway, if he goes that way?
We'll not kick this into the long grass. We'll make a decision. We'll wait and see what Davis says. Is it going to be Heathrow or Gatwick? The one thing which we can't do is prevaricate.
But you're minded to go along with whichever he suggests?
Well, let's wait and see what he proposes. We'll make a decision. We need to expand capacity. I'm not going to preempt Davis, which is why I'm not going to answer your question in that sort of speculative way. But if we were to say, Davis is here, he's made a recommendation, let's duck it, that would be to continue the prevarication. We had a meeting today with the Commission proposal from Sir John Armit, who chaired the Olympics. We had on our panel the chief executives of British Telecom, from National Grid, from Thames Water, from Crossrail, from TfL, all debating what we need to do to make long-term decisions in a cross-party way. It's an agenda which business strongly supports, because without good infrastructure and a political process which can make long-term decisions, we're going to continue to duck these big challenges, and that's not good enough.
It's interesting, isn't it, though? You talk about John Armit a lot. He advises you on infrastructure, of course. He said just a year ago of the energy price freeze, one of Labour's key policies, when governments intervene in markets, economies do a darn sight worse. This points to a problem that we're hearing more about now, which is a lack of confidence in Labour from business leaders.
Well, look, there are some business leaders, and John's not one of these, who are signed-up Labour supporters. There's some business leaders who are signed-up Conservative supporters. Sometimes they get a knighthood or become a Tory peer and do interviews for the Daily Mail. Most business people are in the centre ground, and they're saying we don't want to be involved in party politics, but who will give us the long-term infrastructure, the skills of young people we need, who will keep us in the European Union, reform it, but keep us in, who will help us to create wealth and jobs and rising living standards for working people. That is the pro-business agenda, and that is the Labour agenda.
OK, it's become something of a war of words, which I know you recognise. Ed Miliband called Stefano Pessina, the head of Boots, a tax dodger. Is he?
Look, what I know is he's an Italian who has moved to Monaco and has moved the domicile of his business from Britain to Switzerland.
Is he a tax dodger?
I think in terms of his own tax affairs, clearly that's why he's gone to Monaco, of course. And that's up to him. I don't care about Stefan Pessina avoiding taxes from Italy. I think it's a bit surprising to have somebody who doesn't pay tax in Britain or is a British citizen telling British people how to vote on the basis of innuendo and smear. The interesting thing, though, when you actually look at the policy behind the kind of attacks, the only policy he highlighted in his Sunday Telegraph interview was, we've got to keep Britain in the European Union.
You raised some really interesting points, though. Before we go on to that, is it right for business leaders to have a view on a national debate? Are they to be listened to? And if so, are they to be prioritised?
Of course, business leaders should have a view on debates, and they should be clear why they're contributing, where they're coming from, what their purpose is. If business leaders think we need to invest in our infrastructure or get the right kind of tax decisions made...
It's important to have somebody like him on side, you would have thought.
But Mr Pessina? Well, look, I've never met Mr Pessina. He met my deputy a few months ago. He actually didn't say anything critical about Labour in that meeting, and he employs lots of people in boots across the country whose jobs matter, whose living standards are being squeezed, and I think probably a bit surprised to find out that Mr Pacina, who lives in Monaco, suddenly has a view about Labour versus the Tories.
Would you call him a predator or a producer? This was the phrase that Ed Miliband used in his speech. Is he somebody who does good for the country with his business?
He employs, through Boots, loads and loads of people, thousands of people who work hard every day producing services for people upon which they rely, and I celebrate...
Even if he's a tax dodger, then he's a producer, right?
Of course. Look, I celebrate the work of people in Boots, and I grew up in Nottingham, and I know how important that company is, and I want, I hope Mr Pacina and the new ownership of Boots will keep it as that kind of proud company who looks after its workforce and invests for the long term. I hope so.
So does it worry you then, when you look back to the past elections you fought? In 2001 you had 58 business leaders writing to the Times calling on business to support Labour. 2005, 63 business leaders writing to the FT backing Labour. Where are they this time?
Well, look, there were some business leaders who wrote to the FT saying the opposite before 2010 after a global financial crisis. As I said, there will always be some business people who are supporting Labour. I've been at a dinner tonight with a number of business supporting Labour figures. There'll be some, well, Bill, the former chief executive of EDS, who I was just talking to just a few moments ago before I came over.
Of EDS,
of course, who's a big supporter of ours.
What's his name?
But to be honest, his surname's just gone from my head, which is a bit annoying this time of night.
But he said what? He's supporting Labour. Is he giving you donations? Is he? Which of your policies is he extolling?
He actually chaired the Small Business Task Force, which made 110 different recommendations, which we're going to implement in government. The British Investment Bank is one of the policies which we support, which has been widely backed by
so
business.
The Infrastructure
Commission.
We've got Bill somebody. Have we got anyone else? Because you were talking about 63 or 50 or FTSE 100 leaders. Now we've got Bill somebody.
But as I said to you, there are business people who sign up for Labour. There's Tories like Sir Stuart Rose, who've got into the House of Lords. Most business people, the business people I listed to you who are on our panel today, were people who are not wanting to align politically, but they want to know we're making decisions in the long-term interests of the British economy. They want an economy which creates wealth and jobs, but they also know that at a time when people are really under pressure, and when, look, we know that there's some parties who come along and say, leave Europe, close the borders, stop immigration.
But
the business community knows.
You talk to these people a lot, and you know when you're talking about predatory capitalism, when you're talking about increasing corporation tax, when you're talking about breaking up the banks, they wince.
Look, there are going to be some policies which the business community aren't going to like. Not everybody in the business community, but some. So look, I understand if we say...
Bonus caps, financial transactions tax, the mansion tax, these are all things that you know are pushing people away. These are the people, when Blair wrote in 2010, he said at the Labour loss, tellingly, we lost business. This was crucial. If chief executives say it's Labour that will put the economy at risk, who do voters believe? The chief executives. In your heart, you agree with that, don't you? You're a city minister.
Look, and people know, because unlike Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in 1997, when we'd not been in government for 18 years, many of these business people have worked with the Labour government. We know that they know we made the Bank of England independent. They know we kept us out of this single currency. We introduced an independent competition authority.
And that seems like a very different Labour Party to the one now that's talking about predators and capitalism and increasing corporation tax.
If you take, for example, you refer to the energy companies and the banks.
Breaking up the banks?
We have an independent competition authority established by Labour, which is doing an investigation at the moment into whether we need more competition and challenge in the banking industry. It's happening independently. It may well say we need more competition, but it's being done by an independent process which we set up. I celebrate that. And people in business, they know that where there's problems, and there have been problems with competition and regulation and behaviour in banking, it's got to be sorted out. And they also know if the living standards of working people are stagnating and people turn against business, that will be a big problem for Britain.
OK, so you could just take the bull by the horns and say, you know what, we're proud if we're not making fat cats that happy. We're proud if the average voter on the street says, yes, yes, you know, we want to see them pay more, we want to see bonus caps. Why don't you then come out and say, actually, we don't rate business above everyone else. We don't think that business does matter that much to Labour.
I don't think that we rate business higher or lower, but they're very important. People need to know that the businesses in our community are taking a long-term view, investing for the future, paying decent wages and paying their fair share of tax.
But you could be the left-wing party, couldn't you? I mean, it worked in Greece. You know, it could be that Labour says, do you know what, we're the party that supports the man on the street, fights the vested interests of the big businesses and all the rest of it, and you know what, we don't actually care. Do you care if businesses are slagging you off?
Well, look, we are the progressive party. We're the party of the national minimum wage and a publicly funded, free at the point of use health service. We're the party which wants to make sure we cut taxes for working people and they have decent living standards. But we won't do that unless we have a strong and thriving business community in our country. To answer the question from the chap from Yosishi, making profits, creating wealth and reinvesting them in our country. And you know, the issue is, where is the centre ground and who is in it? Who is the party now saying, let's work with business to see rising prosperity? I think that is actually where we are. Keep us in the European Union, not lurch off to the extremes where you say that we're going to potentially leave Europe and take us back to a 1930s level of public spending, which would mean fewer apprenticeships, second-class infrastructure and our public services undermined. The Tories have left the centre ground. They've lurched to the right. We're the centre ground pro-business party today.
They're yelling in my ear, but thank you very much indeed. Thanks for coming in. Even by ISIS standards, the images released today reached a new low. A video showing the burning to death of a caged Jordanian pilot. The video ended with the names and addresses of up to 100 other Jordanian pilots and offered financial reward for their capture and murder. Within hours of the footage emerging, Jordanian authorities said they'd execute the Iraqi woman the government had earlier sought as part of a prisoner exchange. So what impact will this eye-for-an-eye politics have on the wider conflict? Is this the moment it escalates into full-on warfare? Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, has this report, which contains some images viewers may find distressing.
Earlier today, and those praying for the pilot still had hope. But Islamic State was using his possible release as it used horrific footage of his murder for political theatre.
Should, in fact, this video be authentic, it's just one more indication of the viciousness and barbarity of this organization. And it, I think, will redouble the vigilance and determination on the part of a global coalition.
It was back in December when Lieutenant Muath al-Qassaisbeh's plane went down over Syria. He was quickly captured by ISIS. State TV in Jordan tonight said the pilot was murdered just 10 days later on the 3rd of January. An independent blogger in Raqqa, the ISIS stronghold, tweeted on the 8th of January he'd overheard fighters talking about the pilot being burnt to death. By the time of last week's negotiation about the fate of Japanese hostage Kenji Goto, the Jordanian government was voicing skepticism about whether its pilot was still alive.
The proof of life that we have asked for did not come yet. That is the situation as we speak.
Tonight, an elaborate video, visually slick and carefully choreographed, emerged. The lieutenant is shown going to a bomb site where he is caged, doused with petrol and burnt to death. The video ends with what the makers say are the names and addresses of other Jordanian pilots that it incites the followers of Islamic State to kill. At the Qassaisbeh home, there were scenes of grief.
You could hear the women crying, shouting. Children were also shouting and crying. And then there were images on live TV that I could see that of the men, some of them falling on the floor, completely devastated.
Jordan's king in Washington to sign a big new assistance package with the Americans cut short his visit. Would his country pull out of the coalition? It soon scotched that idea.
In these difficult moments, it is the duty of all Jordanian citizens to stand united, to show the strength of our people in fighting this group. This will only give us more strength in resistance.
Now Sajida al-Rishawi, the bomber ISIS asked for in return for Kenji Goto and other militants, are expected to be executed.
I don't think they will hesitate to execute Sajid al-Rishawi, because Jordan has resumed executions in Jordan after a suspension for several years. Jordanians, unfortunately, probably in their majority, will not be shocked if those two will be executed.
But what about the wider response? Jordan's military contribution to the coalition is small, but it provides vital bases for Western planes and special forces. But Turkey to the north has held back, and there are frustrations in Washington that ISIS in Syria has hardly been touched.
The frustration with Syria is, what are you really trying to do? There are people who want to fight Bashar al-Assad. There are people who want to have some sort of transition. There are people who say there's enough suffering going on. More than 200,000 Syrians have been killed, and half of all Syrians are no longer living in their homes. But where does this go?
Even the leaders of the anti-IS coalition admit privately that while it's made an impact in Iraq, it hasn't yet in Syria. They've still not found the right approach there. Turkey and Saudi Arabia have been pushing the Americans to work more overtly for the removal of President al-Assad. That would carry all sorts of complications with Iraq and Iran, but it could also allow the coalition to operate through Turkey into northern Syria, putting more direct pressure on Islamic State. But for the moment, they are secure there and free to murder whoever they please.
Mark Urban with that report. And just before we came on air, I spoke to General Ali Shukri, formerly a general in the Jordanian army and director of the late King Hussein's private office.
The reaction has been a total state of rage against IS. The country is practically boiling with what they've seen, or those who didn't see the footage that was broadcast by IS, heard the news, heard the details of it as what happened, and I think everybody is looking for the payback. I think we will hear about the first stage of the payback by tomorrow.
What do you expect that to mean?
Well, that would mean we've got something like 4 convicted prisoners who were sentenced to death, but there was a stay of execution in the country for the last 8 years or so. I think that will be activated again, and we might see that tomorrow. If there are any bombing raids tonight over Iraq, that shouldn't be surprising to anybody.
So what do you think this means in the longer term for Jordan's involvement with the coalition against IS then?
I think at the end of the day, initially we had 2 schools of thoughts in Jordan, some saying this is not our war, and some saying no, it is our war. I think what happened now has proven to everybody in the country that this is our war. We need to preempt all these terror organizations, no matter what they call themselves, to make sure they don't come on our borders or even cross into our country. Preemption is the name of the game now.
So how do you preempt? How do you fight ISIS physically?
Well, I think the initial intention, the first part of the mission, or the first phase, I should say, should be to contain them and stop them from expanding and minimize their force, their supplies, and then at the end, we are going to need boots on the grounds to go and exterminate them to the end.
When you look at the negotiations over this hostage's life, Do they ever seem to you that a trick was missed or a mistake was made, or do you understand that he died some time ago?
Well, I mean, the negotiations was happening through third parties, never direct. But remember when they first started negotiating, it was concerning the Japanese gentleman Kenji Goto. They never mentioned our pilot. We insisted for the release of our pilot and Kenji Goto in exchange of Rishawi. But you know what happened? They killed Kenji Goto, and now they aired the film about our pilot. Now our Army HQ issued a statement saying that our pilot has been murdered on the 3rd of January, which is exactly a month today.
And can you confirm then that these prisoner executions, including the Iraqi woman who was initially thought to be part of a prisoner exchange, are happening tonight?
I wouldn't say tonight. If anything, it will be happening tomorrow, the early hours of the day.
So you think by tomorrow evening at least 4 or 5 prisoners will be dead as a result of this?
Well, this is the likely scene.
What do you say, though, to people who would regard this as eye for an eye politics, that you're not solving the problem, it's retaliation on a very single personal level?
Well, I mean, how do you talk to a organization that has sown terror all over the world in the most vicious manner like we've never seen before? You cannot be civilized with uncivilized people, can you?
General, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, ma'am.
Jordanian General Ali Shukri there. Do gay teachers have an obligation to come out to their pupils if they believe it will ease homophobic bullying in schools? The Shadow Education Secretary, Tristram Hunt's encouraging gay and lesbian teachers to be more open with the children they teach, telling Radio 1's Newsbeat they have to have the space for gay teachers to come out so they have confidence to express their own sexuality. Is he right? Newsnight went to Stoke Newington School in Hackney.
When I first started teaching, I remember my first year, my training year, walking past a classroom and kids shouting out the window at me like homophobic abuse. My head said to me, you don't need to tell anyone that you're a lesbian. You don't need to tell anyone, you don't need to be out to your class. For instance, a child might say to you, what's your boyfriend's name or what's your partner's name? And you want to be able to say their name's Sarah rather than their name's, lots of teachers will still lie and maybe say their name's Peter.
I don't think they need to explain the sexuality to people because, you know, it doesn't define who they are like 100%. They can still do their job without telling you their sexuality. It's not necessary.
I was scared. I'd been thinking about it with a class that had sort of asked me a couple of times and I just basically said it's none of your business. And it was quite a tough class and I just thought, oh, they're going to crucify me. But actually I said yes. Eventually I said, yes, I'm a lesbian, And actually they were great.
I don't think that teachers have to be open about their sexuality, but if they choose to, I think us as students we have to accept it. And I think it is good that teachers come out because they do act as role models to the younger students.
Young people are just so open, you know, and lots of people are scared, you know, that young people are going to have a fit because you've talked about LGBT stuff, but actually the kids 9 out of 10 times are brilliant when you start talking to them. It's normally the parents or the outside influence where some problems may come in.
We've had a teacher who used to have banners up and she used to promote it a lot. We would just sit and listen and she would talk to us in the beginning about it and she would say it's perfectly fine to come out, it's acceptable, it's a good thing if that's what you are. And it's been encouraged a lot throughout the school.
You've got a heterosexual teacher in front of you, does that make you heterosexual? If you've got a gay teacher in front of you, does that make you gay? No. You know, I think it's not promotion, it's just talking about people as people.
That was a school in Stoke Newington, and with us now in the studio, David Weston, a former teacher and CEO of the Teacher Development Trust, who came out at a school assembly, and Milo Yiannopoulos, Associate Editor of Breitbart. Thanks very much to you both for coming in. David, take us through your moment, because I know it was a big one. You still hear from pupils that write to you about this, right?
Yeah,
What
that's
happened?
right. It was actually fantastic. So the first thing that happened actually was I'd been quite ill myself and decided, after having seen the film Milk in hospital, where he comes out to many people and suggests that people come out and are just openly visible as who they are. And I thought, I'm going to do that when I get back to school. So in a lesson I was fiddling with an engagement ring, nearly dropped it. Bright-eyed student said, trying to distract me as students do, she'll be cross if you drop it. And I said, well, it's a he. We had a short conversation, actually, and they said, oh, really? Oh, does that mean you're gay? Yeah, that's right. Oh, can men marry? We talked about that. There was a student who was openly gay in the class, and he said, oh, you're not like him.
What age are we talking about?
These were 16-year-olds, 15, 16. So really, that was it. We actually carried on with the physics lesson after about probably 5 minutes, and it was a great physics lesson as well. And then a few months later, I decided to do an assembly and said, you know, as many of you know, I'll be marrying my partner.
And that was the blessing of the school, was it? Or with your
Yeah,
head,
absolutely.
or did nobody...
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you know, I had that conversation with the head and said, you know, would you be comfortable? It's something I'd like to do.
And Milo, if you'd had that experience at school, it would have been great, wouldn't it? Somebody, a teacher standing there in front of you to say, this is all fine.
Well, I don't know. I mean, speaking as somebody who'd like to be a parent one day, I'm not entirely sure I'd be comfortable with it. I'm not entirely sure I'd be happy about it. What confuses me about this entire debate is the sort of need for teachers to out themselves. I mean, in my mind, the job of a teacher is to be a fairly impartial conveyor of knowledge. It's somebody who teaches children facts and teaches people how to acquire facts. And this need for children to become, you know, whatever, whether it's imparting their opinions or their views or their personal circumstances as regard to politics or sexuality or whatever.
Is it about gay or straight? I mean, are you uncomfortable, particularly with the gay element to it, or are you just saying teachers should be...
I'm a little uncomfortable with the gay element. I'm not entirely sure.
Though?
I mean, I'm a gay man. I'm not a self-loathing gay man. I have a very happy, fulfilled life as a gay man. But I'm not entirely sure that I would want my children to have to deal with those sorts of issues very early on. The fact is, irrespective of prejudice, whether or not we take into account the homophobia in the playground, all that kind of sort of nonsense that people sometimes talk about, it's not a particularly happy life, and it's not a particularly happy set of circumstances to find yourself in.
Gosh.
And it's not something that I would really wish my children to have to deal with at that early age. My view on this is quite simple, that teachers are there to be fairly anodyne and partisan of knowledge. I don't really want my children to know whether my teachers vote Labour or support a particular football team, or whether they're homosexual. I don't think it's relevant. I don't think it has a place in the classroom.
David,
and just to say one final thing, sorry to interrupt very quickly, is that, you know, I think, present company accepted, one thing we do know about teachers in this country is that they're barely able to impart reading and writing properly if we believe the international league tables.
Maybe that's
the last thing I want,
point, though, isn't it?
The
Maybe
last
it's
thing
a
I want is
level
for
of
my child to go through the difficult business of working out sexual identity when their teachers are barely able to tell them how to read and write.
There's a lot to unpick there, David. What do you say?
There really is. There really is quite a lot to unpick there. Well, I think one of the first things is actually that Milo said is that you wouldn't want your children going through that. And I think actually let's look at what children do have to go through. So children who are identifying themselves as LGB or T have a much higher level of depression and self-harm and suicide and those sorts of things, and that's not something we want. Broadly speaking, in schools we teach tolerance. We say to people, if you're going to... You don't have to fit a stereotype. Not all boys have to like exactly the same thing. Not all girls have to like exactly the same thing. So I think that's the first issue, that we're teaching tolerance and the fact that you don't have to fit a stereotype.
What about the privacy,
though?
I mean, a lot of teachers will say, you know what, I don't need this extra burden of having to talk about what I'm doing in my sex life at the weekends or any of that.
Well, I don't think any teacher should be talking about their sex life, certainly. I think, so for me,
it's
an entirely...
isn't it? I mean, you know, I don't know who these teachers are that are desperate to express themselves in the classroom, whether they would be better suited to a gay dance troupe.
Milo, is it OK for a teacher to say, my wife and I at the weekend went and saw this? Is that OK?
Well, I don't see that it's particularly relevant to their teaching abilities, but I think that perhaps it would be a good thing to do to simply gloss over the subject if most teachers did.
OK, so in that case, I'll say, well, my husband and I did this at the weekend, and there's really no difference, is there?
Well, you don't see a difference. I obviously do see a difference because I understand that, you know, irrespective of prejudice and homophobia, which we can all agree is a bad thing, but which doesn't really exist in the playground.
But you're not even trying to fight it, right? You're not even suggesting it should be overcome. You're saying run away from it.
No, what I'm saying is that children shouldn't necessarily be exposed to it that early. I don't necessarily want my children to have to deal with that sort of question that early. And also, let's be frank, you know, none among us is rash or arrogant enough to say that we know the difference between nature and nurture in what makes somebody gay. The gay lobby likes to say we're born this way, which has no basis in science
guys,
whatsoever.
We have, of course, run out of time, but fascinating. Thank you both for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Now, all this week, Newsnight's hearing from voices outside the mainstream who have ideas about how to reinvigorate democracy. And tonight, the broadcaster Rick Edwards gives us his thoughts on how to persuade young people to get involved in our politics.
I've spent most of my career making TV shows for young people, and I've seen for myself how active and passionate and enthusiastic most of them are. And so it's worried me that that energy seems to be largely absent from our political system. Only 44% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted at the last general election. Just over a quarter of all 18 to 24-year-olds in the UK voted for anyone in the current government. There is this poisonous myth that young people don't care, but they clearly do. The Scottish referendum proved that 16 and 17-year-olds will come out in force if given the vote. One poll recorded a 75% turnout in this age group. I very rarely talk to any young people who feel like they can't be bothered. Do you know people who you think just can't be bothered?
Yeah. I think it's more like, not that they can't be bothered, because I know that young people, obviously you're interested in your future and that, but I think it's more like we're not taught enough about it, like we don't know enough about it.
What we have to do is our job to just encourage them to want to vote more and want to get engaged with politics. We can't force someone to love politics. You just got to make them more aware of it.
What do you think would be the effect if we moved voting online? So instead of having to go and queue up at a polling station or whatever, you could just do it on your smartphone, tablet, computer?
Overall, I think it will help a lot more because we spend most of our time online. Like I spend most of my time on social networking and stuff, and I think it'll be much more. I think it'll be easier if we do it online as well.
These are the things that I would do to increase youth voter turnout. Firstly, online voting. Young people are digital natives, so let's take voting to where they are. Secondly, I'd introduce compulsory voting. Start the voting habit early. It's been shown that if you don't vote the first time, you're much less likely to vote throughout your life. And thirdly, I'd introduce a none of the above box to offer a legitimate way of expressing dissatisfaction with all of the available parties. Throughout 2011 and 2012, the Occupy movement saw thousands of young people all over the world protest for a fairer economic system. While these camps that grew up in New York and London have been swept away, their ideas continue.
I feel voting actually makes me less engaged in democracy because I don't think the current party political system and the current voting system nurtures democracy.
Do you think that it would be helpful if at the polling stations people had a legitimate way of expressing dissatisfaction, of saying actually none of these parties represent me, so like a none of the above option on the ballot paper?
I think that's a good idea, but there are legitimate ways of expressing your dissatisfaction with all the parties. It's called protest. There are lots of ways of showing your dissatisfaction, and it would be a great shame if you got to do it once every 5 years by putting a cross in a none of the above box.
Several of those guys from Occupy probably won't vote, and yet the idea that they're in any way apathetic is clearly absurd. And in fact, I'd argue that they're doing more. So let's not write anyone off. All of the young people I've spoken to have been very different, but they all want to be politically engaged, and I genuinely believe that any of my ideas would help get them to the ballot box.
More on democracy during the week, but that is it for tonight. The author, Harper Lee, revealed today she's to publish her very first book 55 years after she hid it away to concentrate on her second one, To Kill a Mockingbird. Even more confusingly, this book, even though it was written first, is actually a sequel to Kill a Mockingbird. So it's got a tough act to follow. We leave you with a reminder of just what a devastating critique of 1930s Alabama Harper Lee created. Good night.
Is this the man who raped you?
Oh, certainly is.
How?
I don't know how. He done it. He just done it.
You want to tell us what really happened?
I got something to say. And then I ain't gonna say no more. He took advantage of me. And if you find fancy gentlemen ain't gonna do nothing about it, then you're just a bunch of lousy, yellow, stinking cowards.